So at some point in the future, I would like to experiment an alternative to traditional education that would be specially targeted for marginalized people. And I say marginalized people because I think it really would make any sense to try and change the education system for the average person that works already perfectly as it is. And the best proof is that I can absolutely assure you that to most people, the content of this presentation is absolutely ridiculous and unacceptable. What? I should love my enemy? The God of my society is not the only true God? People who are different than me are not going to burn in hell? Evil does not exist outside of myself? So I'm the one who's messed up, not the others? I don't belong in the superior race or gender or social class? This is absolutely unacceptable to the majority. But if you ask people who've really suffered from the oppression of society, they actually will have an incentive to question all these superstitions. And those are the people I would like to help with a form of education that would be made around the concept of love, openness to difference, like the other gender, cultures, social classes, and so forth, and relentless self-improvement, never trying to blame the other person. So what I'm thinking is it could, for example, start with coaching, which is like education for adults, because we're obviously never too old to learn. And if that works well after a few years, it could be extended and adapted as maybe an alternative education system for some orphanages, like the ones Catherine is working with, for instance. So the coaching would be based on 5 fundamental pillars, which are half yin, that is the more material or practical side, that is in blue, and half yang, which is the more spiritual or theoretical aspect of life, in red. So the first pillar is the most material. It would be about how to make money, and more specifically how to monetize ideas and human qualities originally and independently. Because I'm convinced that there is an entrepreneur in every one of us, and there is no better teacher than failure, over and over and over again until it works. So helping people to cope with failure, see it as a blessing and learn from it, and not indulge in fear and go back and keep going forward, that would definitely be a central element in that pillar. The second pillar is physical. It's about nutrition and exercise for a healthy and good-looking and well-performing body and mind. The third pillar is about social life. It's both practical and theoretical. On the practical side, it would be about how to socialize and adapt to different cultures and social contexts, and also how to better interact with the other gender. And on the theoretical side, it would be mostly about the study of sociology and psychology. The intellectual pillar now is about how to make rational and optimal decisions to improve one's life. How to elaborate a personal philosophy of life that is consistent with one's aspirations and one's reality. It will be about how to think more rationally and efficiently. And that could include, for example, an alternative approach to math and physics. Instead of plugging numbers, really making an effort to understand the theory. Because at school, we're asked to learn formulae by heart and type in the numbers. And that's it. Once we forget the formulae, nothing's left. We all know, for instance, that E equals mc squared. But how many of us really understand what it means? How many of us realize that Einstein's theory of relativity proves that time travel is physically possible? Most people think it can only happen in science fiction. And what about quantum mechanics? Barely anyone knows about quantum mechanics, and even physicists systematically avoid addressing the tremendous philosophical implications underlying it. They just plug in the numbers. It works, period. And our modern technology depends heavily on quantum mechanics, actually. It represents 1/3 of the economy. And that's all that matters, really, like money, once again, So the last pillar is spiritual, which in my opinion is what lacks the most in modern society. And that would be about how to always be happy and love unconditionally. The point here would be to learn about hermetic and esoteric spiritual practices from all over the globe and across ages, and encourage people to find one, or even create one, that will fulfill them. Meditation, fighting the ego, unconditional love, and contentment are typically the common denominators of such practices. So the idea is to ensure that people are balanced and capable in all these areas, because at the end of the day, they are all very much interconnected. Modern society wants us to be super specialized robots, which is absolutely amazing to make the overall system more economically efficient, but it isn't so great for personal development. How often today do you see a philosopher who is also a great scientist? You know, it's not that common, but in the past, the greatest geniuses in history were often both, because they saw the connection, the thread between all sciences. And I would like to quote, Catherine here, because she told me something that I think is extremely true. She said once, "Intelligence is the ability to make connections." And I think it's the best way to explain what intelligence is. And I think Albert Einstein would not disagree, and he even said once, a knowledge of the historic and philosophical background gives that kind of independence from prejudices of this generation from which most scientists are suffering. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. That's from Einstein. And he also said, "Great spirits have always found violent opposition for mediocrities. The latter cannot understand it when a man does not thoughtlessly submit to hereditary prejudices, but honestly and courageously uses his intelligence." And that's actually exactly the same message that is in most spirituality, including in the Quran. Don't follow, hereditary prejudices, and courageously use your intelligence. So here's a very, very rough representation of my idea. If the coaching business works, the revenues and the network it generates could benefit a charity specialized in helping marginalized individuals like orphans, criminals, prostitutes, people with HIV/AIDS, and so forth. Both the business and the charity would be connected to a business incubator. So financing will also be sourced from developmental agencies and corporations as part of corporate social responsibility, for instance. And we could also think of arrangements whereby sponsors could earn shares of the businesses started in the incubator. So if any one of you guys have any ideas on how to make such a system work, that way or differently, anything in that same logic, I would be extremely, extremely interested. So finally, I simply would like to conclude with a few powerful quotes from some of the greatest geniuses of the past century. So first of all, I'm going to start with Stanley Kubrick, because he's my favorite artist of all times, actually. According to Steven Spielberg and many others, he's the best movie director in history. And in my opinion, he really is far, far more than that. If you watch his movies, you will see that they are actually extremely sophisticated psychological and sociological analysis of human nature. Movies like A Clockwork Orange or even Eyes Wide Shut, which is very recent, relatively recent, will tell you more about yourself than any school in the world, I can assure that. And just like Albert Einstein, Stanley Kubrick was a very, very poor student at school. You know, the famous story about Einstein's teacher who told his dad that he would never amount to anything, whatever he does. Kubrick had a similar outlook on school, and he said, "I think the big mistake in schools is trying to teach children anything, and by using fear as the basic motivation. Fear of getting failing grades, fear of not staying with your class, etc. Interest can produce learning on a scale compared to fear as a nuclear explosion to a firecracker. And fear is an impediment to personal development." And since we're talking about cinema, I'm sure you all remember what Master Yoda said in Star Wars. Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. And if you think about it, all our emotions are derived either from fear or from love. Fear comes from the animal side of us. It's our survival instinct and our egoistic illusion that we are independent from the universe. We think we need to fight to survive in it. And love, on the other hand, comes from the divine or universal side of us. People who love do not see a difference between themselves and their neighbor, even their enemy. They simply contemplate the beauty surrounding them and are always happy whatever happens to them. And of course, I'm talking about true unconditional love, obviously, not attachment, because that's the mistake that everybody makes. They mistake love for attachment. But attachment in reality is the opposite of love. Love is mutually exclusive with fear, whereas attachment is the very expression of fear. The fear to lose something or someone we think to be ours. And attachment often leads us to hurt the people we think we love, including ourselves. People who are attached to themselves are actually hurting themselves just as much as they are hurting others. And the way it works is this, really. So you have society that puts ideals in our heads, right? That are obviously different from who we really are. People who are attached to themselves refuse to acknowledge that they are not that quote-unquote ideal that society wants them to be, and they end up projecting what they don't like about themselves onto others. So whenever you see someone criticizing someone else, they are actually telling you about something they unconsciously cannot stand about themselves. And of course, they would never admit it. And that is called a projection. And that's actually another great concept from Carl Jung's psychology, the projection. I'd like to not quote him because I've talked about him extensively in this presentation, and I owe him a lot in terms of my personal development. He said, "A man who is unconscious of himself acts in a blind, instinctive way and is in addition fooled by all the illusions that arise when he sees everything that he is not conscious of in himself coming to meet him from outside as projections upon his neighbor." One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, these illusionary ideals that are coming from society, as I was talking about, but by making the darkness, that is their real personality, conscious. To confront a person with their own shadow is to show them their own light. And the shadow is also another concept from Carl Jung's psychology. And, you can describe it as our dark side, our inner personality, if you wish. The yin, from the yin-yang perspective. And actually, I learned about this concept of the shadow by watching one of Stanley Kubrick's movies, that is Full Metal Jacket, about the Vietnam War. It's fascinating. The last quote is probably one of my favorites from Carl Jung. "If you imagine someone who is brave enough to withdraw all his projections, then you get an individual who is conscious of a pretty thick shadow. He has become a serious problem to himself, as he is now unable to say that they do this or that, they are wrong, and they must be fought against. Such a man knows that whatever is wrong in the world is in himself." So of course, the first interpretation of this quote is that our personal world becomes paradise when we love, because it's the only thing we see and the only projection we have. So for example, when Mansur al-Hallaj, that Sufi mystic that I was talking about, when he was tortured and executed, he was smiling the entire time, and he only saw the love of God throughout the entire process. And he fully and completely identified with that. But even from a more scientific perspective, some of the most advanced theories in quantum mechanics and cosmology actually claim that we live in a multiverse made of an infinity of universes. Not only is that theory mathematically accurate, it's also solving a lot of inconsistencies in traditional physics. For example, the weakness of gravity, the multiplicity of shapes in the 7 extra dimensions of string theory. And it even solves actually the grandfather paradox. Because since time travel is possible, then what happens if you go back in time and shoot your grandfather? Then you're not born. Does that mean you automatically disappear? No, you simply create another universe where you don't exist. And we create universes all the time. If we go back to the double-slit experiment, our observation creates a universe where the particle shows up on the right of the screen, for example. And in another universe, it appears on the left. Now, synchronicity makes a lot more sense, even the conflict between science and religion is somewhat resolved. You create your own paradise and you create your own hell based on how you treat God or the universe, or whatever you want to call it. That's divine justice. Everything is predetermined in the sense that all possibilities exist, but you still have free will to go from a universe to another. If you have the strength to overcome the predetermination that, growing up in a specific society, push you towards, which is the message of most prophets and most religions. So, at the end of the day, if you think your universe is messed up, you should be aware that you are the one who is creating it. You are in charge of your universe. So don't let society tell you what to do, because at the end of the day, it is your responsibility and you are the only one to blame. So I'd like to quote Erwin Schrödinger, who's one of the rock stars of quantum mechanics, and he actually won a Nobel Prize for his study in that field. And he said, in itself, the insight is not new. Again, the mystics of many centuries, independently yet in perfect harmony with each other, have described each of them the unique experience of his or her life in terms that can be condensed in the phrase Deus factum sum, I have become God. And the last quote is from Albert Einstein, who wrote, in a letter to a father who had lost his son, the following thing: a human being is a part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. And I put the word prison in bold to link it with my final slide. Because what would be nicer than ending the presentation with a synchronicity? So that quote from Einstein about the prison is actually very, very similar to what I had read on the back of a book about Islamic poetry at about the same time. The quote is from Shamsi Tabrizi, who was the spiritual master of the great Sufi mystic Jalal ad-Din Rumi back in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, I believe. And it goes, how can we allow ourselves to turn this world, a magnificent rose garden, into a prison? The layers of nagging thoughts, temptations, and fantasies have spun a web around their own source, the self, like a caterpillar spins a cocoon. In this self-constructed prison, one suffocates. We are those who have turned this prison into a rose garden. Once you have seen how one can turn a prison into a rose garden, then look penetratingly for the true source of all the rose gardens in us. Thank you very much.